obviously a very difficult week for all of us. I thought I might start with a brief invocation. Dear Lord, we gather this evening while our community and communities across the nation are reeling from multiple calamities, some inflicted by nature, some by bad actors during the past week, and some the result of injustice and indifference of the past. We ask your blessings on us, and more importantly, on those directly affected by the tragedies of this week. Grant wisdom and empathy to our leaders, compassion to those who need it the most, and the determination for all of us to seriously address the problems that beset us. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 It's been such a difficult week that I'm totally unable to get onto Zoom on my computer. So hence I'm doing it on my iPhone, despite hours of help from Jay to try to rectify the problem. But fortunately, you won't be hearing from me a whole lot. I hope this is the last time we have to do this. The Chill Grill Crab Feast is our next event. That's August 30th, and I sure hope we can all do it in person. But let me, since the Chill Grill Committee is sort of an adjunct of the men's ministry, let me turn this over briefly to John Ross, who wants to say a few words about all the wonderful work the men's ministry has been doing.
Thank you, Bill. And I just want to shout out to Bill for putting this together, our first virtual Chill Grill, and also to Jay Mallon for the technical wizardry he always is providing to make things run. So thank you, gentlemen, for that. And as Bill said, you know, this is part of the men's ministry committee, the Chill Grill. We started out, and the men's ministry also does the annual men's retreat, which many of you have been on, in the first week of February each year. And but during COVID-19, we've got together the committee, and we're doing a whole host of other things, which you may have been reading about in Crossroads. We started a fund called the Helping the Helpers Fund, with a modest goal at first, just to feed a shift at Suburban Hospital of emergency department workers, and to write them letters. And well, the outpouring of support and letters and money was so great, we got way more than we needed just for that. So we have been out there doing all sorts of things with the wonderful support of St. John's. We have been giving hand sanitizers to 2 ride-on bus depots, and we have provided food for the Bethesda Chevy Chase Rescue Squad. We've given PPE to Suburban Hospital, to the Montgomery County Police Department. And most recently, we just finished a mask making campaign, which was more successful than we thought at all. Matter of fact, practically broke our bank, because we agreed to buy material to make masks and elastic for anybody who wanted to. And we had 2021 mask makers, and we offered a sweetener to the deal. At first, just we got to 200 masks, we would donate $500 to Mana Food Bank from our fund. But we didn't get to 200, we got to 300, and we had already thought, okay, well, there's an outside chance that would happen. We'll give $1,000. Well, our intrepid mask makers made 350 of them, so it was superb. And so we sent a check just recently for $1,500 to Mana Food Bank in Rockville, that is doing wonderful work. So, and as a result of that, we are starting a new mask campaign. So the men's ministry, again, is purchasing material, and people at this moment are sewing children's masks for the YMCA facility at Airlawn in Bethesda. And it's a place where Maryland Essential employees can have a child care opportunity while they go around doing the things that we need to do. And they need masks for the children there. So we've committed to 150 masks, and I have every expectation that we'll make more. But anyway, that will wrap up in June. So anyway, we are doing all sorts of other initiatives. We've been supplying electrolytes and protein bars to the hospital workers at Holy Cross. I mean, all sorts of other things. So I encourage you to keep an eye out in Crossroads, because we've got a couple really, really cool initiatives that we're going to be doing in the near future, and hopefully you can be a part of that. If you want to contribute to our fund, you write a check to you can write a check to St. John's and put Helping the Helpers in the memo line, or send something via Breeze on your Visa. But we love those things. Matter of fact, the mosque that we've been working with over the years out in Potomac loved what we were doing so much, seeing it on Facebook, that they gave us a $2,500 donation. So things are picking up and growing and very exciting, and we want to capitalize on that. And we're just happy that we can be doing these things. So without further ado, thank you. Bill, I think you're
muted, Bill.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We were originally going to break down electronically into tables of 6 so we have a chance to talk with each other. That feature does not appear to be available now. So we're going to move ahead into the guest of honor, Jim Rowley. Jim's a longtime communicant at St. John's. You see him regularly at the 11:15 service. And Jim's got an interesting background. He grew up in Rochester, New York, and began his work as what I think was then called a cub reporter for the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. He worked the night shift on the police beat and spent his hours from 6 p.m. to 3 p.m. chasing all sorts of crime on the streets of Rochester. He graduated to becoming a more of a general assignment reporter, moved on to Baltimore, where he worked for both UPI and AP, and then went to the AP Bureau in Washington, where he worked for 15 years, covering Congress, covering the Justice Department, and covering the courts. For the last 22 years, Jim has been with Bloomberg News, covering courts, and now is a congressional reporter for Bloomberg. When he gave me his description of his past work, he talked about the time the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle as covering murder and mayhem. Now that he's back covering the halls of Congress, I don't know that he's covering actual murder, but he's certainly covering a great deal of mayhem. With that, I give it to you, Jim.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate that generous introduction. Bill has asked me to talk about journalism in the age of Trump. And I think there's a couple ways to look at this. One could be approaching it from the in the trenches perspective of the in the trenches reporter who's covering Washington and covering Trump, and also as an examination of Trump as the protagonist and a product in and a product of our political media culture. From a Washington reporter's perspective, covering Trump is certainly the challenge of a lifetime, particularly those frontline reporters on the White House beat who are trying to get him to give them a straight answer, one that provides a semblance of what shall we call candor. I don't directly cover Trump, but I learned from an encounter with him many years ago that it's very difficult to get him to give a straight answer. What he lacked in conventional political experience when he ran for president, he made up for before that with years of dealing with reporters as a New York real estate developer. And he honed his skills, deception, dissembling, evasion, if not outright misrepresentation of the facts, dealing with the New York media. It was during that period that I met Trump. He came to the federal courthouse as a witness when I was, in fact, Jay and I were both beat reporters for our respective news organizations at the time. And Trump had just bought the Eastern Shuttle from another business buccaneer, Frank Lorenzo. You may remember that name. He was the president and I guess principal owner of Texas International Airways, which had bought Eastern out of bankruptcy. And the unions had gone to court to try to get some sort of injunction because they wanted to force him to negotiate the terms of the labor conditions of the shuttle before he sold it to Trump. I don't have any memory at all of Trump, his testimony, what he was asked. I certainly, his haircut certainly made an impression on me at the time. But I have a vivid recollection of trying to get him outside the courthouse to give us a straight answer about what his plans were for the shuttle, completing the deal, and what he planned to do once he owned it. And he basically gave us very non-responsive answers. Many of them were questions as opposed to answers. And after he left, a bunch of us stood around and said, well, aren't we glad we don't have to cover him on a regular basis? It would be awful. So fortunately for me, I don't have any war stories to tell you about the difficulties of covering candidate or President Trump. But I certainly can talk about the challenges that he poses to journalists and to our political discourse. So the dysfunctional relationship between the press and Trump is symptomatic of the state of our political culture and journalism in general. And Trump certainly, as you know, likes to feed an anti-press hysteria in his political base with attacks on reporters either via Twitter or in person at his news conferences. And even though he has working relationships with many reporters, he's not above taking shots at them or their news organizations to score points politically. It's not new. I mean, many of you may recall Spiro Agnew's attacks back in the early 70s, right about the time I was becoming a reporter, calling network reporters nattering nabobs of negativism when Nixon unleashed him as an attack dog. And politicians and bureaucrats and just ordinary citizens have often shown hostility toward reporters for various different motives. I think as a local reporter, I encountered it a lot more than I do now, because people, even if just covering a fire or a crime scene, getting neighbors to talk about what happened sometimes could be difficult. Some people were very cooperative, others just didn't like reporters in general. I went to a protest once where protesters were clashing with police. This was in Rochester, very early in my career. And as soon as the protesters, whom I, of course, was trying to interview, discovered I was from what they regarded as the reactionary daily newspaper, what Trump would call the lamestream media, somebody seized my notebook. And I panicked because, I mean, it had all my notes for the day in it, and I had some stories I had to file off the police beat. I negotiated a return of the notebook, but it was tense for a while. So, I mean, I guess my point of this is that Trump plays on that for his political benefit, and he's not really the source of our dysfunction. He's a product of it. So he's both a product of the political system, but also and the media culture we have. But he's also a savvy exploiter of what we have now, which is a sort of internet-driven 24/7 news cycle. Many other politicians have taken advantage of it, but he's particularly the fragmentation of cable television into these various partisan camps where people watch whatever network seems to reflect their worldview. And those changes all took place before Trump even announced his candidacy. But he's adapted to the new media landscape a lot better than many of his opponents, particularly Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. The pace of news gathering and publication has changed dramatically, and politicians like Trump count on the public's shorter than ever attention span to forget what they said or did the day before they contradict themselves, so they can contradict themselves or rewrite history. And there's such a torrent of news that it's easy to say that the public doesn't have much of an attention span. They're so busy processing the next story that they forget about the last story. I mean, I have my own problems doing that. And then you have something called tweet storms, which is something that was unheard of until a few years ago in this age of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Various stories go go viral, as we say, on social media. Trump was forced to try to explain when the shooting starts comment after there was a tweet storm of reaction. And Biden did the same thing after his comment that you're not really black if you have trouble deciding whether to vote for me or Trump. I mean, he encountered a blowback on social media, which prompted his apology, which I think was quite quick. It was a lot more sedate back in the earlier days of my career, back in the early 70s. Newspapers and the two wire services, AP and UPI, controlled the timing and pace of publication. Good reporting takes time, and if you have a big story you want to break exclusively, you spend a day or two, maybe longer, trying to nail down the details to make it more compelling or to make sure you have it right. And in those days, you didn't have that much competition, so you could easily determine whether somebody was on your trail. Nowadays, it's much harder because there's so many of these niche publications, websites and so forth, BuzzFeed, and every network has reporters whom you don't even see. They're just working on a website that comes out. Daily Beast is another one. But those days are over, and now stories have a very short shelf life. So do tips, and reporters compete just on the Hill just to beat the government or some congressman doing an announcement. And that's always been the case, but now it's taken to very extreme degrees and people who are providing that information are playing people out, rewarding or punishing reporters as they see fit. And to give you an example of the kind of media manipulation that's gone on forever, and this is a more benign form, people who know are usually quite savvy about the mechanics of the news business. And Al Gore was particularly good at this. He'd been a reporter in his early days before he became a congressman and senator. And the AP, which was my former employer for many years, was sort of king of the hill, because congressmen knew that if they gave the AP a story, it would likely show up on the front page of every newspaper in their state or their district. And so it was like media penetration, basically, kind of like getting your ad out there. And Gore would often try to take advantage of, he knew how the news business worked firsthand. And he would send us press releases on something like the Tennessee Valley Authority or something, and we'd just throw it in the wastebasket in the Senate press gallery. And a couple hours would go by and the press release was gathering dust in the bottom of the wastebasket. And his press secretary had been instructed, well, call the Tennessean, which is where Gore got his start. And the Tennessean would get a pitch from the press secretary. They would call the National Bureau of the AP, which would then request a story, which would go right through our management. And of course, we had to write it. I got stuck with one of these one day, and I was cursing Gore's name each of 300 words that I wrote on it, whatever it was. And that's an example. That's a sort of benign example of what media manipulation is about. But nowadays, for instance, there aren't too many interviews with Trump's cabinet members that don't occur on Fox, because they know they can encounter friendly questioning they wouldn't necessarily get from one of the networks. And of course, people like Adam Schiff and Jerry Nadler were regulars on Rachel Maddow on MSNBC during the impeachment inquiry for the same reasons. They could get their message out there without having to deal with knotty questions like, well, is this really going to cause political problems for Democrats to push this impeachment? You've probably heard from reading press criticism of the difference between fairness and false equivalence. News organizations strive to be as fair as possible because it's the basis of our credibility. We can't be seen as favoring one side or another. So we try to get both sides of the story. But as one side of the story becomes more absurd or preposterous, it's difficult to carry out that mission. And Trump certainly tries to play on the outrage that he provokes to try to get us out of our zone of competence, to share in that, and makes us look less as objective analysts, to therefore demonstrate to the public that we can't be trusted because we're not. So we have to resist the temptation to indulge ourselves with outrage. Fairness, objectivity, and accuracy are the touchstones that we should never lose sight of. But being objective doesn't mean that we should be myopic, or that we can afford to be myopic. And so in the news media's zeal to get both kinds of political dirt in 2016, for instance, we went wild covering each leak of the internal Clinton campaign emails, which had come out from hacked by WikiLeaks, distributed by the Russians, with sort of the public encouragement of Trump. And Trump was essentially taking advantage of the fact that the media would be so engrossed by the gossipy details of these emails that the story became the contents of John Podesta's emails or somebody else's emails, rather than the fact that they'd been hacked and were being distributed to try to disrupt things. So reporters have to consistently ask ourselves as editors, why are they trying to feed us this stuff? What is it in the food that would be deceptive to both us and our readers? And I think we failed in that respect. As Margaret Sullivan, who writes a media column for the Post, said, we made the emails a mountain out of a molehill. And so the ultimate question is this news or is it propaganda? So I'll leave it at that, and I'll let people ask questions about. There's much to talk about, from say Twitter's recent tagging of Trump's tweets and so forth.
I have a question.
Sure.
Jim, can you comment a bit about how Trump manages to control the narrative and perhaps how that might be handled differently?
Well, every president has a natural advantage of being able to control the political narrative because he's the president of the United States. And so it's almost, as I said before, it's kind of like a Pavlovian, if I didn't say that, I'll say it again, I'll say it now, a Pavlovian response. If the president holds a news conference, we cover it. And we cover it, sort of from beginning to end, and the cable network will probably carry the whole thing. And it's always hard for the opposition politicians to counter that narrative, even if they control Congress, which the opposition only controls one house at this point. But I think that the press is getting a little bit savvier about dealing with Trump's misstatements of fact. I mean, the print press certainly labels it a false accusation or a misrepresentation or a mischaracterization. And I think that the networks are not quite as ready and eager to give him as much say out of a news conference as they once did. I think there's a little bit more critical, but there's no question he controls the narrative. On the other hand, I think that Pelosi is becoming very adroit herself she's been controlling the narrative about the legislation of the stimulus bills that were passed by exercising her leverage and publicly explaining what it is that Democrats want. She's on television every day practically. She's doing an interview somewhere, and I think it's proving very effective.
Jim, Peter, I have a question that's sort of related to Roxy's. Ever since the 2016 campaign, it struck me that the news media pays much too much attention to the president's tweets and I think that really a relatively small percentage of them are newsworthy in the traditional sense. So what's your view on coverage of tweets and whether there is too much of it?
It's hard to get people to restrain themselves when the president of the United States is tweeting all kinds of outrageous stuff. I'll tell you a story about that. Mitch McConnell was in our office for breakfast once. This was, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And when Eric Holder was the Attorney General. And he accused Holder of doing something that was going to benefit Obama's reelection campaign and his donor, and somehow to raise money for it was an official act. And it was just clearly false on its face, but we felt the pressure to write something about it. And we put out a little blurb on the wire. And after we did this, we called, which is the way we do things. I may or may not agree with that, but that's how we do it. And I called the Justice Department's public affairs director to get her response to this. And she gave me this long lecture about how I should know better because it was a falsehood. And I said, well, it may be a falsehood, but it may say more about Mitch McConnell than it does about the Justice Department. But I need your response to this. You want to make a point. And of course, she didn't want to make a point. She didn't want to say anything. And McConnell knew, I guess, that DOJ he had actually worked there in an earlier capacity in Washington. And he probably knew that this was a trap for them. He could get away with saying something like that because they weren't going to dignify it with a response. But I mean, in some respects, I mean, the larger point, I guess, is that Trump says these things, and the fact that the president of the United States is saying the looting starts and the shooting starts is news, because I mean it's horrible, and he is the president, and people should know he's saying these things. I agree that it's not necessarily the most important story of the day, but the fact that he's stirring the pot now and fanning the flames of racial animosity and hatred for protesters and reporters or whatever is part of the story.
Jim, it's Ann.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Ann.
Thank you for this. It's so interesting. You mentioned Twitter's recent step to fact check the president and that whole brouhaha. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Really interesting, because both Facebook and Twitter have kind of, in the view of a lot of us in the news media, have kind of reneged on their responsibilities. They see themselves as kind of public access channels, and they really aren't. I mean, they're as much a publication as anything, and I can't just get on the AP or the Bloomberg Wire and say what I want. I mean, there's editing, and the fact that he says these things that are patently false, such as the fact that absentee balloting, mass mail-in ballots leads to fraud, it's worth. I mean, if he says that to the Washington Post will say he made a charge without evidence, or a patently false charge that this is true, and point out that studies say that this isn't the case, that in fact there's very little voter fraud of any sort, either at the polls or through absentee balloting. And we have an obligation in our stories to put his comments in context, which I think goes to Peter's point. Do we give him too much of a say by reporting his tweets? And I think we would be derelict if we didn't provide context and rebuttal based on our knowledge of the facts. And I think Twitter has up until now been remiss. In fact, I think a few times it has now tagged his tweets is a nice start, but they've got a long way to go. In fact, I read somewhere, somebody suggested that perhaps they should just go back and fact check all of his tweets. I imagine that would require a considerable investment of time and money. And I think part of the reason that the social media platforms have resisted doing it is they don't want to get in the business of becoming an editorial news organization, and Zuckerberg is still taking that position. But I think that that's part of their responsibility. I mean, Trump uses Twitter as a megaphone because he thinks that it will be unrebutted. He can take,
Right.
he knows people are going to respond, but there are a lot of people who are just going to take his tweets as fact, at face value. And I think we do have a responsibility. And of course, he's distorted the First Amendment debate. To take it one step further, he says, well, they're interfering with my freedom of speech. He doesn't have freedom of speech on Twitter. I don't have freedom of speech at Bloomberg. I mean, freedom of speech belongs to the publisher, owns the press, or the electronic platform. And private entities, as a matter of law, are not obligated to just give people a free say. His attempt to bully Twitter or any other social media platform by threatening to regulate them for questioning his factual assertions, that's a First Amendment problem. I mean, at that point, if you're trying to censor what is in effect a news organization or any any citizen, that's a First Amendment. So I welcome what they're doing. I hope they do more.
Yeah.
There was a story in the Times today, I was reading right before we got on, about sort of looking at how they came to this decision. And I think they've been wrestling with it for a long time. And it sounds like it's kind of a tentative move on their part, but I certainly would hope that they would continue it and do it more comprehensively, at least going forward.
Is there ever a point at which they draw a line? If you know that someone is simply exploiting the media, social media or traditional media, telling lies, flat out lies, what do you do about that? If someone's a president, you have to keep covering him no matter what?
Well, I think they have the same conundrum we face. I mean, do we ignore the fact that the president is telling lies? I mean, the fact that you can argue that what he's doing says more about him than the facts that he's trying to shape, the narrative he's trying to shape. And they do have they have rules, terms of service, I guess they call them, that if you glorify violence, for instance,
right,
you can be banned from Twitter. And his comment about looting and shooting, they said this glorifies violence, but their explanation for why they didn't ban him from Twitter is that he's the president of the United States, and we can't ban him because it's newsworthy that he's trying to do this. So by making the implicit argument that it's newsworthy, they're sort of implicitly acknowledging that they are newsworthy.
That they are what? Sorry.
Lost the
Lost
sound.
you. Lost your sound.
I'm back. Okay. Was that Trump trying to silence me, or?
No, it's the Russians.
So I mean, they're beginning to. I think Twitter, at least, is beginning to acknowledge they're a news organization, or they have editorial responsibilities, other than just having an open mic that anybody can grab and say what they want.
Well, that's important. That's important potentially.
The question is
Absolutely.
the others do it, you know.
Well, I think that to some degree, and the story in the Times study did not address this, but this is kind of a brand thing too. I mean, there's competition between Facebook and
Yeah.
and I think that maybe they're calculating that this will make Facebook look better if they don't. Make them look better.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Julia?
Oh yeah, Jim. I wanted to ask a little bit about the arrests of the press, like in Minnesota, and where, the governor has come out and said this was unacceptable. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about the reactions and what should be the reaction.
It's outrageous that they arrested these people. I mean, I suppose it's understandable that perhaps the police that came in didn't know that they were supposed to stand there. And we get into these things with the Capitol Police a lot, where they do things, overzealous officers do things that their commanders at least profess to be outraged by or appalled by. Sometimes not, but no, I think it was really a pretty bad. It's a form of prior restraint. I mean, I watched the video of this the other night, and it's clear that they were trying to, the guy was not at all being confrontational. He said, look, if you want us to move, tell us where to move. Because there's this kind of implicit bargain with police that you're allowed to be there as long as you don't get in the way of them trying to do their job. And we take the position when we're covering the Hill. I don't have a lot of experience as a street, like Jay, who was down at the White House the other night. I haven't done a lot of the street reporting of civil disturbances, but I've been around situations where on Capitol Hill where there's security and the cops tell us to move. Well, we move. We don't argue with them. We might complain later that they shouldn't have done this, but we'll move. In this case, the guy was saying, tell me where to go and I'll go there. And they just wouldn't say, and then they just suddenly arrested him. So, and he was telling them that this is where we had been told to stand by these other officers.
And do you
so think, I think, I'm glad that Tim Walz said what he said. I mean, I think that was, and that's something I would have expected of him. Walz is somebody I knew when he was a Minnesota congressman, and he seems like a pretty stand-up guy.
Okay. So
I'm sorry. I don't know if anyone is aware, but I was watching, I think it was MSNBC, I think it was last night or the night before, and Ali Velshi, one of their reporters, was actually hit with one of the rubber bullets. So that was another reporter, and it was just everything had been calm, nothing was happening, and then the police came in and fired tear gas and rubber bullets without any warning. There was no five minutes to discuss or anything.
Well, I think that's a risk that reporters take when they go out into situations like that. And I didn't see it. I don't know about this, but it sounds like that she was caught in the crossfire, as it were. It wasn't necessarily aimed at her. I was tear gassed pretty badly once when I covered an event where the police had surrounded a house where they thought somebody had a gun and had killed a bunch of people inside, and the tear gas just sort of blew back in my direction. So they're just risks that reporters take in situations. Fortunately, the stakes were low in that case, but in my case.
John, did you have a question? John?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, thanks. Quickly, Jim, I was wondering about, and I don't want to start mixing too many metaphors, but as we possibly will get to where Trump is off to his political graveyard, I'm wondering about the Superfund costs of the residual effect of his whole demeanor. What do you expect after? What's the post-Trump attitude going to be? Is this going to be in the playbook for other politicos, or how do you see it? And can we eradicate it in some sense? Can we superfund it?
Well, that's a very good question. And we've certainly noticed there are other imitators out there who are deploying Trump's tactics because they think that they will get ahead by using the same methods. Ted Cruz, I think, and Tom Cotton, who's a senator from Arkansas, the two that quickly come to mind. Jim Jordan, to a lesser extent, from Ohio, he has his own distinctive style. But I think that if the Trump is discredited by a resounding defeat, and I'm not predicting that by any means, but say that happens, I think that would go a long way toward repudiating that kind of tactic. I'm not saying it's going to be eradicated, but it's like everything else in the marketplace of ideas. It will rise or fall depending upon its ultimate success.
Hey, thanks.
Bill? Yes? Oh, Bill, you got to unmute yourself. Uh-oh.
Jim,
Yes.
let's suppose there's a Biden administration, and the Biden administration decides it has more important things to do than respond to Trump tweets or Trump statements or Trump anythings, and basically ignores him. You think the media will still feel compelled to report what Trump rants about?
I think that if Trump were a former president, I think there will be some obvious attention paid to him, and he will obviously try to use the media to disrupt whatever's going on. But I think that if in fact he is repudiated politically and turned out of office, I do think that he will wear out his welcome pretty quickly. I mean, he's not going to be able to control the narrative. I mean, whoever the president of the United States is going to control it. Is going to have a much more. I mean, if Biden is the president, he will have the same, shown the same sort of media deference and attention that Trump enjoys now. And Trump will be like any other most ex-presidents go quietly and don't interject themselves into the daily political process, and I fully expect they'll try, but I think that will ultimately run its course. But that's just my prediction at this point.
Anybody else?
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the false equivalence. You talked about like the emails, and I've heard of some past incidents, with equating 99% of meteorologists' opinions about climate change with a fringe 1% or something, and I think people have said that kind of happened with the rise of creationism, maybe, or the recent rise of it. Do you know of other examples of false equivalence?
Well, I think the one that Trump is certainly trying to peddle during the impeachment, and what led up to the impeachment thing, is that Hunter Biden was somehow and Joe Biden were bad actors in the Ukraine, and that what Joe Biden was doing to try to get a prosecutor fired was no different from what Biden was doing. I have to get some more water. There's all this pollen.
Your tough questioning drove them out of the room.
It was such a nice venue sitting on my porch, but I don't know.
Jim, as your pastor, I should ask you, are you okay right now?
I'm fine, thank you.
All right, good. Okay, my friend.
I guess, that's an example of where Trump was trying to dig up political dirt on Biden by extorting actions from the president of the Ukraine by threatening to withhold military aid and whatever. And now his supporters are trying to make it look like somehow Hunter Biden's, I think, ethically questionable association with Beremus, that Ukraine energy company, was somehow equivalent to what Trump was doing, or his dealings with China. I mean, it's just not. I mean, history is littered with the children, siblings of prominent people trying to cash in on their relations prominent place in government. I mean, Donald Nixon, Billy Carter, there's lots of them. Those are the ones that come to mind. So I mean, I think we have to that's to me, those are good examples of false equivalence.
Thanks.
And also maybe say the FBI's there was definite concern about the FBI's misconduct in terms of the way it got some of these surveillance warrants in the Russian investigation, notably the extension of the Carter Page surveillance. The Inspector General found that the FBI deceived the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And I've talked to Democrats and Republicans who are disturbed by that. I mean, the Democrats, you have to sort of pin them down a little bit. I mean, there's a partisan spin that's put on all this, but I think that's why they're having trouble passing this legislation that would revive these provisions of the law that lapsed in March. But that's false equivalence. I mean, yes, I mean, the FBI did something bad, but that doesn't mean that the Russia investigation was invalid, or that the Russians didn't try to interfere with our election, or that the Trump campaign was receptive to whatever help the Russians offered. Whether or not there was actual collusion that added up to a crime is another matter. But they're trying to rewrite history, and they're trying to use false equivalence to do that.
Thank you.
I see John Angst has a second question, but was there anybody else who wants to, hasn't had their first turn? And then we'll probably finish up with him and go to Bill.
No question on my part. I'm done. Thank you. I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. I thought I misread the question. So Bill?
Hey, let me ask one more thing before we close out. Sort of a discussion we had a couple of weeks ago, Jim, about what I think of as the moral cowardice shown by congressional Republicans. And we particularly were discussing Lindsey Graham, who used to be a stand-up guy. I actually admired him. And now he grovels at Trump's feet. You know, is there any honesty and integrity left among Capitol Hill Republicans?
Well, they certainly are a sorry lot these days. They don't show a lot of spine. I think they're intimidated not only by Trump because they don't want to be humiliated by him in front of their constituents, but they're also cowed by the Trump base, much the same way that they were scared of the Tea Party. The Tea Party was the first wave of it, and so I think that's, and we'll see just whether they pay a price politically or not. And if they do, then, I mean, the polls even seem to show that Lindsey Graham is in a tight race, which is hard to believe in South Carolina. But
Wow.
I certainly think that Romney is somebody to look up to at this point. He's certainly, he's not afraid to criticize the president. And Lamar Alexander, who of course is retiring, hasn't always been a model of courage, was critical of, trying to think what it was. It had to do with the health part of the CDC guidelines the other day. He was disagreeing. Oh, I know what it was. He was disagreeing with the decision to withhold money from the World Health Organization. He thought that was counterproductive. It would ultimately make it harder for us to get vaccines for the next pandemic, or maybe even this one. That's something. I'm not saying that's a great exertion of moral courage, but or example.
So Bill?
So I thank you all for coming. I particularly thank Jim Rowley for speaking. I particularly thank techno wizard Jay Mallon for doing all his magical things. Hopefully the next time we have a chill grill, it'll be a crab feast, and we'll all be together in person on August 30th. Good evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you
God
all.
bless everyone. Thanks. Great seeing
Thanks
you
a
all.
lot.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Bill.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Jim. Fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. Thank you,
Welcome.
Ann and Hank and Nancy.
Jim, hang on for just a second. I'm going to share something